Teal dear, let's have another chat about Addyi and Sprout Pharmaceuticals, shall we? Because there's a couple of things that I'd like to clear up from the last video, and a couple of things that I'd like to have put in addition, but couldn't really find the time nor the place in that particular one to get the information out there. So consider this one a little bit of an addendum or an extension, if you will. Firstly, I would like to address what appears to be a fairly sizable misconception that some people have developed about Addyi. And up on the screen here are a few examples of this misconception. Some people seem to have got the impression from my last video that flibanserin or Addyi is going to be some kind of date rape drug or some kind of legalized date rape drug. And this is perhaps my fault for not being clear enough about how someone goes about acquiring Addyi. Flibanserin, or Addyi, is not some over-the-counter drug. It's not something that is easily accessible to the public. In my last video, I made reference to the Addyi REMS Program Prescriber and Pharmacy Trainer. That is the risk evaluation and mitigation strategy. Now, I assumed that the name of this particular document would have said everything that needed to be said, but apparently some people are unclear about it. Addyi, or flibanserin, is only available via prescription. It is not an over-the-counter treatment. Moreover, and more accurately, it cannot be prescribed by just any healthcare professional. You have to have completed the relevant paperwork in the REMS document and submit that to the appropriate bodies which are mentioned within that document before you are permitted to prescribe or distribute flibanserin. In addition to this, the REMS document goes to great lengths to emphasize the risks and the dangers of using flibanserin with alcohol, and how it must not under any circumstances be prescribed or distributed to anyone if there is even the slightest doubt about their ability to totally abstain from the consumption of alcohol. The REMS booklet even provides a sample patient-provider agreement form, something which must be signed by both the prescribing doctor and the patient before the prescription can be issued, and you can quite clearly see this document in bold. I understand that I must not drink alcohol while taking Addyi, and that part of the agreement is detached and given to the patient along with their prescription. So as you can see, distribution of Addyi or flibanserin is very heavily controlled. It's not like every doctor is suddenly going to start handing out Pez dispensers full of them. And given how massively ineffective Addyi was seen to be in all of its trials, with only some 10% of women actually reporting the supposed positive effects of it, while 75% of women suffered some sort of negative interaction with the drug, even this document points out that Addyi is indicated for the treatment of premenopausal women with acquired generalized hypoactive sexual desire disorder, as characterized by low sexual desire that causes marked distress or interpersonal difficulty and is not due to coexisting medical or psychiatric conditions, problems within the relationship, or the effects of a medication or other drug substance. So even this document is basically saying, try one of the several already existing treatments for female sexual dysfunction before using Addyi. So even though the FDA has allowed Addyi to go out into the market, this FDA document is basically hinting or very heavily implying that Addyi is an absolute last resort medication. So hopefully that's cleared up the minor misconception that some people have that this is going to be a commonly available drug that's going to fall into the wrong hands and be used as some kind of nefarious date rape drug because of the high likelihood that it causes women to lose consciousness, especially when combined with alcohol. This is really something that should not happen because of how controlled Addyi is going to be. Will we see instances of Addyi being used as some sort of date rape drug? And will Addyi come under some sort of fire or scrutiny in regards to the issue of sexual consent, considering that it enacts a change in a woman's brain chemistry and can cause loss of consciousness or disorientation when paired with alcohol? Very possibly. But to state this as some absolute inevitable, I think is overstating the issue. But I will not deny the possibility of such an issue being raised in the future. because hey, Tumblr does exist.
And now for something completely different.
Indeed, let us now consider politics. Sprout Pharmaceuticals had rather a large amount of support from several groups, but there are two of these that I find to be rather interesting. The first is the National Organization for Women, and the second is EvenTheScore. The National Organization for Women first. I was poking around their website, just getting some information and general background knowledge on the charities or organizations that had helped to back Sprout getting Addyi pushed through FDA approval, and I happened upon this on the National Organization for Women website regarding the FDA Safety and Innovation Act Section 907 report. The action plan for the collection, analysis, and availability of demographic subgroup data for FDA-approved human medical products. And it's the first couple of paragraphs of this document that I find to be rather interesting, given the circumstances surrounding Addyi and Sprout Pharmaceuticals, and its very varied history. So if you wish to read this for yourself, feel free to pause the screen and do so. But basically, the first paragraph here points out that the National Organization for Women wants change in the way the FDA regulates things because the racial makeup of, particularly in this instance, the United States has changed. There are a considerable number of Hispanics in the country, there are a considerable number of African Americans, and basically what they're saying is that drugs are predominantly too focused on testing the white population, and maybe there aren't enough Hispanics or not enough blacks in the testing process to be fully sure that a drug is entirely safe because of basic biological differences between ethnicities. And this is a reasonable point. If you expect a drug to go to market, you do need to be absolutely sure that it will work on everyone. Or if there are potential issues that can arise due to racial boundaries or racial differences, that should be something that should be very well documented so it can be taken into account when that drug is being administered or prescribed. But the second paragraph is where this gets interesting, as it goes on to state here, the inadequate representation of women and of racial and ethnic communities as well as of older persons in clinical trials is clear from the 907 report. Variation in response to drugs and devices by sex, race, and age has been documented. And then further down, the long-standing and current lack of diversity in clinical trials puts at risk the health of major segments of the population. And then, rather interestingly, the first sentence from the third paragraph, because some companies have been reticent to invest in pre-market or post-market clinical trials on diverse populations, it is imperative that the FDA be firm in their directive in this area and enforce the requirement for diversity and subgroup analysis. So what the National Organization for Women are saying here is they would like to see very extensive testing done on drugs before they go to market, and then ideally again after they are on the market, which is entirely reasonable. But this makes me curious, because you will remember in the last video that I did about this, that all of the actual academic peer-reviewed medical research that was done on Addyi was performed by Boehringer Ingelheim and was all dated 2012 or earlier. Because in 2012, Boehringer Ingelheim of course sold the rights to Addyi to Sprout Pharmaceuticals, who to date appear to have not published anything in any actual peer-reviewed medical journal about Addyi. That is to say that all of their research has been independently published and therefore not necessarily verified by the peer review process. Now, peer review is of course not infallible and can be open to manipulation, but it is a helpful tool nonetheless. So, on that ground, I find it very curious that the National Organization for Women would back this drug, given what they are publishing here, stating that they would like to see more thorough research being done both pre- and post-market. But the bit that I find most curious, even after they have written this document in which they have expressed a distinct interest in seeing drugs tested on the most diverse groups possible to ensure that they are basically safe for the market, that they would then back Addyi from Sprout Pharmaceuticals, who you will remember tested its interaction with alcohol using a group of 23 men and 2 women. So after the National Organization of Women have expressly stated that they would like to see diverse groups being used by the FDA to test these medications, or to make sure that the organizations putting these medications up for consideration have performed tests on diverse groups of people, they would back Sprout Pharmaceuticals, an organization that has clearly flouted that desire, not only by totally lacking diversity in their own testing, but mostly testing their drug on a group of people for whom it's not even going to be prescribed. And I just found this very, very interesting, that an organization promoting women's rights and women's well-being will quite rightly demand high levels of testing on medical products to ensure that they are safe for public consumption. And note in that document there, they're not gender-specific or race-specific about it. They want all drugs to be tested across all racial boundaries, across all age boundaries and gender boundaries. And yet, when a drug comes forward touting itself as the first drug on the market to treat female sexual dysfunction, this standard of theirs seems to evaporate, and they just push to get it through approval, despite the fact that the very studies being used to push this through the FDA approval absolutely contravene their original guidelines for what they said they wanted. So very curious. And now to EvenTheScore, the organization, not some act of revenge or vendetta. EvenTheScore, a group that was very vocal in its support of Addyi, and of course they released that little celebration video when the FDA finally approved it. So I nosed around their website a little bit just for funsies to see if I can find out a little bit of information about them and why they would be so eager to back Addyi. And basically the entire thrust of their campaign is this 26-to-1 ratio. The fact that there are 26 drugs approved by the FDA for male sexual dysfunction, but currently only 1, which is of course Addyi, that has been approved for women. Now, this, of course, totally ignores the apples and oranges comparison that they are pulling with this ratio. As we discussed in the last video, we looked at male sexual dysfunction compared to female sexual dysfunction. We found that male sexual dysfunction, the vast majority of them, is basically a mechanical problem, the most prevalent of which is, of course, erectile dysfunction. So while the male is still mentally capable of becoming aroused, it is simply that the body does not respond as required, and as such that a treatment is needed that will facilitate the body's response to that desire. But when we compared that to female sexual dysfunction, we found that there was considerably more going on, that it wasn't necessarily a mechanical problem, but that it was generally more of a psychological issue or an emotional issue. In other words, in the majority of cases when women suffer from sexual dysfunction, it is more often the case that the woman is either mentally incapable or mentally less able to become aroused. Even though there's nothing physically wrong with them or physically preventing them from doing so, it tends to be more psychological. Which is why treatments are harder to produce, because ultimately they have to change brain chemistry in order to reach the desired change, as opposed to the male alternative, which is simply vasodilation. Medically considerably easier. But that's all very by the by, and I'm getting sidetracked. But I suppose it's nice to know that the entire thrust of their argument is based on totally flawed reasoning anyway. But the thing that I found on this website that was so very, very interesting to me, one of the organizations that supports EvenTheScore is Sprout Pharmaceuticals. Now, how exactly they support EvenTheScore is currently unknown to me. It could simply be a head nod to its existence, or it could be financial backing. I'm pretty sure there's a word for when pharmaceutical companies pay private organizations to promote their products. I just can't think what it is. Oh well, that's probably for the best, because I wouldn't want to slander anyone after all. But it's not like Sprout Pharmaceuticals would have any reason to want to manipulate the market at all. I mean, sure, they just closed a deal with Valiant Pharmaceuticals, who are going to acquire Sprout Pharmaceuticals on a debt-free basis for approximately $1 billion in cash, and that this was prompted basically as a direct result of Addyi getting through FDA approval, with the backing of these other organizations, to become the only medical female sexual dysfunction treatment on the market, despite the fact that it basically doesn't work and is thoroughly unpleasant for the majority of people who do take it. There is nothing suspicious going on here at all.